Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to yield to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, 1/2 of my time, and that he be allowed to control that time.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on the conference report to accompany H.R. 2670, that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of FY24 National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA is one of the most consequential bills Congress considers. Passage of this bill each year sends an important signal to the men and women defending our freedom that Congress can function and will prioritize their needs above all else. Enacting the NDAA has never been more vital than today. America and our allies face unprecedented and rapidly evolving threats from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorist organizations throughout the world. These threats are real. We all just witnessed terrorist acts on their threats against one of our closest allies in the Middle East. And we all pray for Israel as it counters the most vile attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. To stay ahead of these threats, DoD came to Congress this year, as they do every year, to request critical new authorities as a part of the National Defense Authorization Act. We took those requests seriously. We held dozens of hearings to examine them. Then we worked to improve them and add our own priorities through the committee and floor processes. We followed regular order and had a conference committee for the first time in 2 years. We fought the Senate for weeks over each other's priorities, and we came to a compromise. That's what's before us today. I'll be the first to admit I'm disappointed we didn't get all the priorities we wanted. But you know what? The Senate is pretty disappointed they didn't get the priorities they wanted either. It takes compromise to move legislation in a divided government, and this bill is a good compromise. It's laser focused on deterring our adversaries, especially China. The conference report includes critical new authorities to ensure our warfighters have what they need to deter our adversaries and prevail in future battles. It goes a long way toward ending woke policies being forced on our service members by left-wing bureaucrats. It includes provisions that ban critical race theory and require promotions based on merit. It includes several provisions that require accountability from the administration, like a special inspector general for Ukraine aid, and a deadline for the DoD to finally pass an audit. It improves the security of Israel by extending weapons transfers and expanding joint military training. And finally, the conference report carries important new quality of life improvements for our service members and their military families, including the largest pay raise in over 20 years. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a compromise, but it's a good compromise. It puts the need of our service members and our national security before all else. I urge members to support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. I apologize. I wasn't sure. It doesn't go to Mr. Roy next?
Goes to you.
Goes to me. All right. Well, I want to just concur. I yield myself 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I concur with the chairman's conclusions. We worked this process as bipartisan and as open as any process in Congress. We had the markup in committee. We had the floor vote. We had a bunch of amendments. The Senate did the same. We went to a conference committee, and we had a very robust discussion. We have disagreements. There are a lot of things in this bill that I do not like. But we have bipartisan control here. We have the Senate controlled by the Democrats, the White House controlled by the Democrats. They have to sign the bill, and the House controlled by the Republicans. So we worked a good compromise. And what this bill does is it supports our troops in their efforts to defend this country and to meet our national security needs. It has a robust pay increase, it has increases in basic housing allowance, and a number of other provisions to support our troops and their families. Critically, it solidifies our alliances with our European allies, with our allies in Asia, and with Israel and our allies in the Middle East to meet the threats that we face. You cannot oppose this bill and claim that you support the national security of this country, because this bill represents that bipartisan compromise that we worked for to get a good bill to meet our national security needs. And again, I will emphasize, to support our troops and to support their families. Nothing is more important in the national security of this country than the people who we ask to defend it. This bill protects them. I urge every member in the body to support it. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I do rise in opposition to the National Defense Authorization Act, and I say that respectfully to both sides who negotiated the bill, but I think the points that have been made here make my point. I mean, the fact of the matter is, what's being stated is it is impossible to oppose the National Defense Authorization Act because we put a pay raise in it, or because we put something in there that is seemingly so important that we have to ignore the critical destruction of our civil liberties by adding FISA extension right on the top of it, without doing the reforms necessary to protect the American people. We do this every year, and then we're told, oh, congratulations, we just had a conference committee. No, we didn't. 5 people didn't even sign the conference report, because what happened was a deal was cut by leadership, by the 4 corners, to shove down a predetermined bill into the conference and said, take it. And then 5 people didn't sign it, and they sent that conference report back to us, and they said, take it, pass this before Christmas, or you're going to leave our men and women in uniform stranded. That's what occurred. That's what's actually happening. And with that, I will yield such time as the gentleman from Florida shall consume.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for as much time as he'll consume.
I regret that I rise in opposition to this NDAA because there is a great deal of good in it, but only in Washington must we bring a bill to the floor so that we are able to militarily confront China while at the same time embracing the policies that make the United States more like China. There is no desire on the part of our great armed services chairman and even the Democrats we worked with to have an extension of spying authorities put in this bill when we have already seen those authorities just totally abused. 278,000 violations of the existing law as the FBI has queried information regarding Americans. When the Obama-appointed Inspector General was reviewing whether or not the administration was complying with existing law, they found out we were breaking the law 38 times an hour to extend the authorities for spying that were being violated so that people at the FBI could do queries on their neighbors, their coworkers, their ex-lovers. That does not belong in the National Defense Authorization Act, and maybe we would be able to stomach some short-term extension if the underlying bill looked a little more like the product we sent out of the House of Representatives. With this NDAA conference report, you almost feel like a parent who's sent a child off to summer camp and they've come back a monster. That's what we've done. This bill came back in far worse shape. We had concern over these social justice warriors that were making, salaries in the hundreds of thousands of dollars at DOD, so we put a cap on that at 3 times what a private or airman would make. And we claim that that's still in the bill, but the Senate was able to erode that and say so long as that social justice warrior is assigned any other responsibility, they're able to blow through that cap and waste taxpayer money on something that doesn't enhance our lethality or capability or survivability. We had legislation to eliminate the chief diversity officer at DOD because that was the fountainhead of so many of these woke bad ideas, and yet the House receded on that position. Many of our colleagues were concerned that it seemed when you look at our military bases or installations, they were flying flags that weren't the American flag, that the LGBTQ flag, the Black Lives Matter flag, whatever that flag is with all those pink and black triangles in it. And that desire that we had to have the American flag, the flags of our service branches, that was also surrendered by the House of Representatives to the Senate. We wanted a parent's Bill of Rights in DoD schools so that you wouldn't get the strange material that goes into radical gender ideology or race ideology. That abandoned by the House of Representatives. And so we also expressed a great deal of concern over the censorship that the DoD was funding through a lot of its alliances. We put in our bill a prohibition on marketing through those networks that have engaged in broad-scale censorship, and unfortunately that was replaced with a report. So instead of stopping the money flowing to censorship through the DoD, we've just asked to be informed about it as it's happening, even though we already know it's happening. That's why we've conducted these investigations. So this bill is insufficient to deal with the structural challenges that we have at the Department of Defense, where they have veered substantially left. There is good in the bill, but it does not deserve an affirmative vote with this just absolutely unnecessary and uncalled for extension of spying authorities that we already know have been abused. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before I yield to my friend and colleague from the committee, I want to respond to a charge that was made earlier that only 5 members voted or refused to sign the conference report. There were 35 core conferees. 30 core conferees did sign the conference report. I now yield to my friend and the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee on the HASC, Mr. Lamborn, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this year's NDAA, and I thank the chairman for his leadership. I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. I'm pleased that 53 provisions I led in this year's NDAA received broad bipartisan support. Through this bill, conservatives have achieved major wins that counter harmful Biden administration plans to treat our military like a social experiment. However, we must continue to make necessary investments in our strategic forces. We must prepare to simultaneously address 2 peer aggressors as well as deter the growing threats from Iran and North Korea. And this bill does that. I urge my colleagues to support the bill to ensure our men and women in uniform have the resources they need to defend our nation. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman
I continue
from
to
Alabama
reserve.
reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly on the 702 issue. 702 needs to be reformed. There's no question about that, all right? Nobody I know of, however, says that it should completely go away. Well, if we don't do it on this bill, it completely goes away on January 1st, which is a huge national security threat to this country. Universally agreed. Now, I agree with the gentleman. We should debate that policy. But it's fascinating because on Tuesday, we were set up to debate that policy. We had a couple different choices there. And the very people now who are screaming, you can't extend this without reform, blocked the rule that would have allowed us to reform 702. So it really doesn't make any sense. What this bill does is it gives us time to do the reforms that need to be done without jeopardizing national security. And with that, I will yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the House Intel Committee who knows this issue very, very well, Mr. Himes.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I just reemphasize what the ranking member said. We had a robust conversation about 702 this week, and there should be more robust conversation. What is completely intolerable is the notion that the authority should be allowed to expire. As ranking member of Intelligence, by God, let's reform it, but do not let it expire. If it expires, Americans and allies will die. But I rise in support of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2024 and congratulate Chairman and Ranking Member of the Armed Services Committee for their constructive work on this legislation, which advances our national security. The partnership between the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee is as strong as it has been during my time in Congress, and I believe that this contributes to enhanced oversight of the agencies charged with protecting national security. Among the many provisions of the NDAA, I want to particularly highlight the Intelligence Authorization Act, which is incorporated as Division G of the NDAA. Under the leadership of Chairman Turner, the Intelligence Committee has worked collaboratively and effectively to advance the IAA. The conference agreement we have reached with the Senate advances our national security while supporting the brave men and women of the intelligence community. FY24 IAA includes numerous provisions, the vast majority of which were developed on a bipartisan basis. To highlight just a few, the IAA includes a number of proposals I developed jointly with Chairman Turner intended to accelerate the IC's adoption of cutting-edge technology, particularly artificial intelligence. Our ability to leverage emerging technologies to the IC's mission will determine our ability to stay ahead of our adversaries in a world of great power competition. The legislation also includes sweeping reforms to how the CIA handles allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment. These reforms come out of a bipartisan investigation in which we found that too many CIA officers have experienced sexual misconduct, and the agency's protocols for dealing with these incidents were often frustrating and not centered on victims. Our legislation would streamline those processes so victims know where to turn and what to expect. Madam Speaker, there is no question we face dangerous and complex challenges around the world. The IC's unique capabilities are what continue to give us the edge over our adversaries and keep Americans safe. I urge support of the NDAA and with the IAA, which is included, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank the Speaker. I want to clear up one misconception, that somehow there was a block of us who were denying the ability to have a rule on the floor with respect to FISA 702. The fact is, the question was there was going to be a rule for something called Queen of the Hill, in which two bills would have been put forward with no amendments, none. There would have been no debate on the House floor. There would have been no ability to amend it here on the floor. As usual, it would have been the people who say they're the only ones who know the information needed to make the decisions for the American people, to do it in a committee behind closed doors, often in the skiff, without half of us knowing any of the information, and then bring it to the floor and say, take it or leave it. That was what was going to occur, and we said we shouldn't do it that way, that what we should do is bring in a bill to the floor that would reform FISA, allow us to offer amendments, have a debate on the warrant requirements, have a debate on who it applies to, and decide whether or not we're going to actually protect the civil liberties of the American people. But instead, no, what we're going to do is pile on an extension of FISA on the back of our defense authorization, that is on the back of our men and women in uniform. We're going to allow it to be extended and the procedures extend until April of 2025. That is what your people's house is going to do. I yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Montana.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 90 seconds.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much to my good friend from Texas. In July, the House Republicans passed the most conservative NDAA in history that ended Biden's taxpayer-funded abortion travel, stopped taxpayer-funded gender transition surgeries, and prevented American citizens from being indefinitely detained without charge or trial. And I was proud to vote for that legislation. I understand that this bill would change in the Senate and knew that compromise was inevitable. However, I cannot support a bill written by the D.C. Uniparty that removes all of the reforms and watch as leadership once again suspends the rules we fought to restore, preventing members from even amending this flawed legislation. Even worse, this legislation includes a clean extension of FISA Section 702, which allowed the FBI to spy on U.S. citizens more than 278,000 times without a warrant. The FBI, under President Biden, has been weaponized against the American people, and major reform is needed. FISA should not be combined with our national defense, and it is unacceptable that leadership is bypassing regular order to jam members by forcing them to vote on two unrelated bills with one vote. And make no mistake about this, folks. This one vote will allow the United States government to spy on you and the United States military to lock you up in Guantanamo Bay without representation. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Speaker, at this time I'd like to recognize one of the most senior members of the Armed Services Committee and a real leader on national defense issues, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Congratulations, Chairman Mike Rogers and Ranking Member Adam Smith, for the diligent work for this bipartisan NDAA, which I support. The axis of evil, war criminal Putin, the regime in Tehran, the Chinese Communist Party, dictators with rule of gun, invading democracies with rule of law. This makes the passage of this bipartisan legislation more important than ever. I'm grateful to have provisions included: authorization for operations for critical missions at the Savannah River site, including plutonium pit production and tritium finishing facility; the U.S.-Israel Future of Warfare Act, which provides for collaboration on defense and technology for border security; the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, protecting American companies from demands for bribes by corrupt foreign officials. This is the most significant anti-corruption law since the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, which promotes peace through strength. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank the Speaker. I would note that even if Section 702 lapses in the end of December, the intelligence community will remain able to conduct 702 collection and queries until April 11th, 2024. And by the way, that's just even setting aside Article 1 authority, which the President of the United States can go exercise, but under the current 5th certification. Number two, if the NDAA is passed with a FISA extension, as I said before, to April 19th, 2024, will enable the Biden administration to seek another year-long certification, which would kick it until April of 2025. Both of those points have been independently corroborated by CRS attorneys as recently as August of this year and by Trump administration attorneys under similar circumstances, as reported in the New York Times in 2017, an article that laid that out in the New York Times. I would like to yield 90 seconds to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 90 seconds.
I thank the Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know it's Christmas, and you can sure tell because here we go with the ornaments. We got a Christmas tree headed out, and we got to put some ornaments on it. That's what's happening right now. And of course, we're going to violate our rules. You saw it here just a few moments ago. This violates the single subject rule because Americans are literally sick of their representatives coming home and saying to them, well, you know, I didn't want to vote for that, but this was on it, and we had to get this, so I had to vote for that. That's how this town works. That's how you end up $34 trillion in debt, and that's how you spy on 278,000 Americans under the federal government's authority. It violates the germaneness rule. People say, well, what does that matter? Why does it matter if it's germane? Ladies and gentlemen, the House passed a bill, a pretty good bill, thanks to the chairman, a pretty good bill. The Senate passed a bill. I don't think it's pretty good, but they passed a bill. Either way, you know what wasn't in either of those bills? The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, used to spy on Americans. That wasn't in the bill. But at the last minute, it was airdropped into this bill. And on this House, when we asked, because we put in the rules, we need to know what the single purpose of the bill is. When we asked, what is the single purpose of this bill? This House said, we're not even going to tell you that, American people. We're not going to tell you that. They're not going to tell you that because they want to couple these two things together, pass a terrible National Defense Authorization Act, tell you the troops aren't being paid when they are being paid, and allow the federal government under the guise of law to spy on every American citizen. It is unconscionable. It is unacceptable. You should vote no.
Time is expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This time I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague from Virginia, the chairman of the Tactical Air Land Subcommittee, Mr. Whitman.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman for yielding. War is on our doorstep. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Iran's proxy conflict with Israel, North Korea's long-range ballistic missile development, and China's belligerence in the South China Sea, an axis of evil is rising again. These nations seek to challenge the security of the world that has provided our nation's prosperity since World War II. But we are answering the call with this year's NDAA. We drafted this bill to address the growing national security threats while taking care of our service members. The bill increases the top line of defense to keep pace with our national security challenges. It provides 5.2% service member pay increase, the largest increase in 20 years. This bill provides a path for COVID vaccine service members to be reinstated. The bill curbs a reckless administration's diversity, equity, and inclusion appetite that detracts from warfighting. The bill provides needed force structure focus by retaining critical aircraft and ships, preparing us to deter conflict before 2030. My friend, this is the right bill at the right time. We need it urgently to deter catastrophic conflict.
Gentleman's
I
time.
want to recognize Ranking Member Norcross.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I thank the chairman and urge members to support and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
May I inquire as to how much time the various folks have left here?
Gentleman from Washington has 5.5 minutes. Gentleman from Alabama has 4 minutes. Texas has 9.5.
Hey, I yield myself 1.5 minutes.
You are recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to really focus on this notion that this is how this town works and how terrible that is. I really don't understand where people get the idea that the way the world works is you get absolutely everything you want and nobody else gets anything. This isn't how this town works. This is how life works in your family, in your community, in your neighborhood, everywhere. And I know you guys know this because we just had the vote on Israel not long ago. And I would ask you, what does the IRS have to do with defending Israel? And yet somehow you guys decided you had to put the IRS cuts in with the Israel bill, and you all voted for it happy as a clam, all right? Let's get away. If you don't like the deal, fine. Vote no. That's cool. But the idea that you're saying, oh, this is just the worst process in the world, apparently you don't like democracy. Because that's what democracy is. You compromise, and you work with people, and you do it all the time. Argue against the substance of the bill, but please stop tearing down this institution and tearing down this democracy. We have to try to get along with people we don't agree with. I'll quote Game of Thrones. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies, okay? You gotta find a way to get along with people who you disagree with. And the chairman of your committee did an outstanding job of doing that in this bill. And I urge everybody to support it.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
So the question is who gets to decide? That's the question. Who gets to make these grand pronouncements of who is going to compromise? Because it sure as hell wasn't any of us. That wasn't the deal. What was tried to be done with FISA was to bring two bills to the floor unamendable, decided only by small groups of people. That's what was occurring. And with respect to this, it was decided by leadership, both sides, to take and jam FISA extension on the back of our men and women in uniform, bring that to the floor in violation of our rules for single subject, and then say, take it or leave it. That was what was done. That was the compromise. See, if you poke the bear in this town, right, they don't like to be poked because it changes the way this town works. Heaven forbid. Because it's been going so well, so beautifully, that we have $34 trillion in debt, and that we have rampant spying on the American people that is occurring. In 2020 and early 21, the FBI conducted 278,000 improper searches of Americans, according to the 2022 FISC report. We're just supposed to trust the FBI has fixed that. In June of 2022, an FBI analyst conducted 4 queries of Section 702 information using the last names of a United States senator and a state senator based on information that a foreign intelligence service was targeting those individuals. We have rampant abuses going on, and this body is just going to extend the very mechanism of those abuses on the back of the National Defense Authorization Act and say, have a nice day, Merry Christmas, go home and have your turkey, go home and be with your families. That's what's actually occurring. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
In the last round of debate, House Republicans were criticized for providing a pay-for our plan to support Israel out of the IRS. And the theory is that, well, it's just totally unrelated. But a pay-for the things we are doing, that is always related. It is only in Washington, certainly not in many of our state capitals, where you can have an ambition to go fund something and then not identify the offset that would naturally allow you to engage in that. And the only real substantive debate I've heard in favor of this bill is that it does good pay increases for our service members, and undeniably that has universal agreement within this body. But I think about the 8,600 service members who were forced to separate from our military because of an ill-conceived, now withdrawn vaccine requirement. And we were told over and over again that there would be back pay and reparations and restoration of rank for those people who were improperly told that they could not express their patriotism through military service because they didn't want to take an experimental vaccine. And yet that is totally absent in this legislation. And so in communities like mine that are military heavy, the 5% pay increase will be very welcome. But every one of our military families knows someone who now is not able to have their job, who has seen impact to their spouses, to their marriages, to their children because of this mandate. And we ought to have really taken care of those great folks. We didn't in this bill, and I am all about compromise. But to me, compromise ought to reflect the work of the House and the Senate, and then linking those matters up. Neither the House nor the Senate version of this bill dealt with extending spying authorities, as my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, said. That was something that was added in, so that's the process objection. Not that we're unable to compromise on that which we present different views on. It's when a totally new issue just parachutes in and drops on what would otherwise be legislation we would want to agree to.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
My friend from Florida, who is a member of the Armed Services Committee, knows very well there are hundreds of provisions in this bill that are good for our service members, in addition to the 5.2% pay raise, which is the biggest in 20 years. And with regard to the individuals who had to leave the service because of COVID, this bill provides a pathway back for them to get into the service without a rank punishment. There is much in this bill that he knows is good, and to characterize it as having only the pay raise as a reason to vote for it is disappointing. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to a real leader on the Armed Services Committee, the chairman of the subcommittee on cybersecurity, Mr. Gallagher of Wisconsin.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the bill. As you look across the world, deterrence is collapsing, and we in this body need to do everything possible to restore it. And as chairman of the Cyber Information Technologies and Innovation Subcommittee, I'm proud of many provisions we got into the bill that will spark innovation across the Pentagon, that will strengthen offensive and defensive cybersecurity and ensure our warfighters are equipped with cutting-edge technology that they need today. I also want to thank the chairman for working with the Select Committee on the CCP to include a lot of our recommendations, including enhanced cyber cooperation with and prioritization of aid to Taiwan and detailed analyses of China's defense spending. At the end of this process, I think the chairman and the ranking member can proudly say that we will have done our work on the Armed Services Committee. We will have authorized what we need to authorize, and that's a testament to their leadership and the spirit of bipartisanship they've set. But we also do need to appropriate money to the Defense Department, and we have not done that. We're having a debate about a supplemental, which begs the question, what are we supplementing?
Gentleman's time has
expired. If we don't appropriate, we'll lose $37 billion.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I would just point out that the money from the IRS was not a pay-for. It actually increased the deficit. Under the rules of the House, the people who decide how to score those things scored it as adding money to it. So it wasn't a pay-for. It was going after the IRS to appease people so they could vote for the larger package. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This time I'd like to recognize an outstanding freshman of the House Armed Services Committee, Mr. Strong of the great state of Alabama, for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. I commend Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Smith for their leadership and thank both sides of the aisle for your vigorous debate while working together to create a bill that is focused on the defense and security of our nation. The NDAA passed through the House Armed Services Committee by a vote of 59-1. This shows that Republicans and Democrats can work together to solve our nation's problems. This committee put national security first and set an example on how to bring a bipartisan bill to the United States House floor. I urge my colleagues to support the FY24 NDAA on behalf of our nation and the American warfighter.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Sorry, may I inquire again as to how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from Washington has 3.5 minutes. Gentleman from Texas has 5 minutes. Gentleman from Alabama has 2.
Thank you. I'm pleased at this point to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member on the Tactical Air Forces. I'm getting the name of the subcommittee at this point. He's the ranking member of subcommittee. Mr. Norcross is right.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, Chairman. Congress has a really proud tradition passing our annual NDAA, and passing this bill is as important as ever. The NDAA is a result of hard work that you've heard, both sides supporting our military and providing our warfighters with the tools and the resources they need. This bill includes my enhanced Buy American legislation to support American jobs by ensuring reliable stability and security of our defense industrial base, strengthening the relationship with our trusted allies. A strong military begins with a U.S. defense industrial base built on domestic components by an American workforce. The fiscal 24 NDAA is a testament to compromise. I'm grateful that the TAL Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Whitman, and certainly our professional staff for the work they've done to get this across the finish line for the American people, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. We are here because it's right before Christmas, and everybody says, we must pass this. Okay, we should pass the Defense Authorization Act. We should deal with FISA, but it shouldn't be an extension of FISA that continues the same procedures that have been abused and extends those procedures through April of 2025. But yet that's what we're going to do. The fact of the matter is, an NSA analyst backdoor search for the communication of 2 individuals the analyst had met on an online dating service. An NSA analyst backdoor search for the communications of a prospective tenant of a rental property they owned. A backdoor search for the names and dates of births of individuals registered competitors in an athletic event. A backdoor search for 1,600 Americans who had flown through an airport during a particular date range and were either traveling to or returning from a foreign country. All according to a report from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. The FISA court issued opinions in 2018, 19, 20, and 22 decrying FBI agents' persistent and widespread violation of such safeguards. Now, I do believe we have bipartisan reforms. We just passed a good bill out of Judiciary. I believe it's a good bill passed out of Intel. I prefer the Judiciary bill. I think we should be debating those. I think we should have one bill on the floor, and I think we should amend them. We have 18 days left in the calendar year before FISA allegedly expires, which I already detailed. CRS attorneys and other outside experts detailing how they will continue to be able to collect data under 702. But we could get it done by December 31st if we actually did our job. But instead, what we're going to do is kick the can down the road, and we're going to empower the court to be able to set the procedures in place for another 16 months, because that's what we do. We are the house of kicking the can down the road. It's what we do every year. We're doing it right now. We're doing it today. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Madam Speaker, as I listen to this debate, I'm reminded of how blessed we are with incredible staff on both the majority and minority side that have spent months preparing this piece of legislation. And I think that it's important all of us to take a pause and thank them for all the hard work they've done in preparing this bill, and particularly the overtime they put in the last few weeks. With that, I want to recognize another outstanding freshman member of the House Armed Services Committee, Mr. Carlos Jimenez from Florida, for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The United States is facing a host of pressing issues, from Communist China's increased aggression in the Indo-Pacific to attacks by Iran-backed Hamas terrorists against our dear friend Israel. This NDAA ensures our military is ready and able to meet these challenges head-on. In South Florida and across the nation, living and housing costs are a priority for our men and women in uniform. This NDAA secures a 5.2% increase in pay to our service members, the largest in 20 years, and authorizes $394 million more in the President's budget request for the new family housing and barracks, and increased eligibility for cost of living allowances. While this NDAA may not be perfect, it fully funds our military, enhances capabilities and readiness, and supports our brave service members.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Gentleman from Alabama reserves until time to close.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Sorry, as I understand it, I go second to last, and I'm prepared to close at this point as well.
Gentleman's correct.
So, yes, yeah.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Another point that I think merits observation is, as we speak, with the 18 days remaining, the Senate, rather than working on ensuring that we get a better NDAA, but more importantly in this context, because that process has kind of played out, rather than figuring out how we're going to deal with FISA and reform it to make sure American civil liberties are protected, we have the Senate in negotiations with the White House on figuring out what crumbs we can be given for border security to be attached to Ukraine funding, while Zelensky is paraded around Washington trying to demand more money for Ukraine when our border's wide open. So the Senate has plenty of time to hold themselves here in negotiation with the White House so we can beg for crumbs for the protection of our sovereignty and security of the people of Texas and the people of this country. But we don't have time to figure out how to fix FISA. It's pretty extraordinary. It's pretty extraordinary. And in the meantime, in this very bill is $600 million authorized for Ukraine. Now, I'm actually not personally all that troubled by those provisions. We supported them in the authorization bill in July. But I would note, importantly, to my colleagues on this side of the aisle, a majority of Republicans opposed an amendment for the continuation of that funding to Ukraine in a September vote on the floor. A majority of Republicans opposed that funding. And yet, we are authorizing it here on the back of a number of provisions that we don't support and on the back of FISA being piled on the top of that defense authorization bill. For the life of me, I do not understand why this is how Republicans think we should end the year heading out for Christmas. I reserve.
Gentleman, is the gentleman prepared to close?
Can I go first on? Yeah. Yes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for closing.
We have come to the floor today on a bill that all of us want to see passed. Every single one of us want to pass a National Defense Authorization Act. Every single one of us wants to ensure that our men and women in uniform are paid appropriately, have the tools they need to carry out their job, have the care when they get home, and that we do our job. Every single one of us wants to make sure that we do that. But we are doing a terrible disservice to the people of this country by piling on an extension of a FISA regime that was abused, notably, clearly abused against American citizens without reforming that piece of legislation, by kicking the can down the road, by extending it not just through April, but through April of 2025. A vote for this bill is not just a bill for pay raises and support for our men and women in uniform. A vote for this bill is a perpetuation of the woke policies undermining our military, breaking down morale, driving down recruiting, and now undermining the civil liberties of the American people by not reforming FISA. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I think the most revealing thing said by the gentleman from Texas was a majority of Republicans. A majority of Republicans supported something, so how possibly could we not do it? And that really reflects their opposition. They would like a majority of Republicans to control this bill. Now, to the credit of the chairman and others, they recognize that bipartisan compromise is what we have to get to. They believe that what they want, they get regardless of how anybody else votes. Not the way the process works. We've worked a very good bill, got a very good outcome here. We haven't even mentioned things like the AUKUS agreement, a crucial agreement in deterring China and strengthening our allies. Whole lot of things in this bill that are going to have a very positive outcome on national security. Also, I do want to point out that this is important for the House to be involved. If we insist upon the notion that everybody has to agree, we become irrelevant. This is the House expressing oversight of the executive branch. And yes, it's on the defense bill, but it's also in the intel bill, and it's on the foreign affairs bill. And if we aren't able to do that, the executive branch becomes more powerful and we disappear. On the appropriations process, we tried that. The House couldn't pass roughly half of the appropriations bills because everybody insisted on having it exactly their way. And again, we've rendered ourselves irrelevant. Please vote for this bill. It is the reflection of a bipartisan, bicameral effort of the legislative branch to assert its authority and its obligation to exercise oversight. Lastly, I want to echo Mr. Rogers' comments. Our staff is beyond fantastic. Have not had as much time in this debate to thank them as I would like. They've done a great job. The floor staff, the parliamentary staff has pulled it all together. And one note of personal privilege, I want to specifically thank Connor Stubbs, my legislative director, for his outstanding work. He has the bad taste to be leaving my office tomorrow, going on to bigger and better things, but he's done an outstanding job and is really reflective of the entire staff that I have, Mr. Rogers has, Hask, Sask, tremendous people who work more hours than anybody could possibly calculate to make this happen. So thank you very much. And again, please vote for this bill. It's enormously important that we do so. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to close by reminding my colleagues who are considering voting against this conference report of what it actually does and what you would be on record opposing. The FY24 NDAA requires military promotions to be based on merit and performance, bans the teaching of critical race theory in our military, requires border wall materials to be turned over to our southwest border states, caps the pay of Pentagon DEI bureaucracy, defends Israel with additional weapons transfers and military training, prohibits the closure of Guantanamo Bay and transfer of terrorists to U.S. prisons, bans the contracting with Chinese companies, protects our military bases, defense research, and supply chains from Chinese espionage, trains and equips Taiwan, provides a path back to service for those discharged over COVID-19 vaccine, creates a new monthly pay bonus, improves housing and expands benefits for junior enlisted service members and their families, and finally, the NDAA provides for the largest pay raise in over 20 years. I urge all members to keep those things in mind when they vote today. With that, I want to thank Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Smith and Wicker. It's been great to work with this process. I also want to thank our staff, House and Senate staff. They're just top notch. And I want to thank the leadership on both sides, as well as the tremendous professionals of the Office of Legislative Counsel, Congressional Budget Office, House Parliamentarian, and the House Clerk for all their help. Finally, I want to thank the brave men and women in uniform for their willing service and sacrifice around the world to keep us free and safe. And with all that, I urge all members to vote in favor of the conference report, and I yield back.